Something extraordinary just happened in Canada. While Alberta's Premier Danielle Smith tried to turn regional frustration into a national crisis, Prime Minister Mark Carney turned the tables. In a single week, he managed to disarm a separatist movement, silence foreign interference, and pull Alberta back from the edge of open conflict. What makes this moment shocking is not that Alberta threatened separation again, but that Carney, instead of fighting fire with fire, cooled it with a new kind of politics based on cooperation, patience, and quiet strategy. For decades, Alberta and Ottawa have argued about the same things: oil, taxes, and end control. The West feels ignored. The East feels blamed. In 2025, those tensions returned when Premier Smith sent Ottawa a letter listing 9 demands ranging from pipeline approval rights to tax powers. In Alberta, it was seen as a declaration of defiance. Smith told reporters that Alberta will not be treated like a branch office of Ottawa. Her supporters cheered. Within hours, hashtags about independence flooded social media, and talk radio across the prairies buzzed with calls for a referendum. Carney's response was nothing like his predecessors. He didn't call a press conference or denounce Smith. Instead, he read her letter carefully, instructed his ministers to prepare replies, and then told journalists that he viewed it not as a list of demands, but as issues to be solved for Albertans, for Canadians. The tone was deliberate. By removing the drama, he removed the stage. Separatists thrive on confrontation, and Carney refused to give them one. Behind the scenes, his office set up working groups between federal and provincial departments to study each of Smith's points. Energy officials, agricultural advisors, and Indigenous leaders were quietly invited into technical talks. Within 2 weeks, nearly half the issues had joint task forces exploring compromises. Political analysts in Ottawa immediately noticed the shift. Instead of turning Alberta's grievances into a national showdown, Carney reframed them as a shared project. Pollster Nick Nanos told CTV that Carney is changing the vocabulary. This is no longer about rebellion, it's about results. That rhetorical pivot matters because it deprives separatists of their main claim, that Ottawa ignores Alberta. Energy policy remains the fault line. Alberta's economy still relies on oil and gas, producing roughly 3.6 million barrels a day, over 80% of Canada's output. Smith argues that federal climate rules threaten jobs and revenue. Carney, a former central banker who understands the global energy market, responded with a grand bargain. Instead of debating whether Alberta should drill, he focused on how it can keep drilling while cutting emissions. He pointed to the Pathways Alliance carbon capture pipeline, a multi-billion-dollar project linking oil sands facilities to a massive underground storage hub. Ottawa pledged federal tax credits. Alberta guaranteed regulatory fast-tracking. Environmental groups were stunned. For years, they had battled Alberta's oil lobby. Now they found Ottawa working with it. Carney defended the plan by saying, "This is how we grow jobs today and build prosperity 10 years out." According to internal projections, the combined carbon capture and hydrogen expansion could create 35,000 construction jobs and preserve another 80,000 in the energy corridor. Economists at the University of Calgary estimate that without such cooperation, Alberta's GDP could shrink by 3% by 2030. With it, the province could gain nearly $20 billion in new investment. Even some of Smith's critics in Calgary's business community acknowledged the value of the deal. David Miller, who runs a mid-size equipment supplier, said his company has survived 3 oil slumps in 15 years. "What we need is predictability, not politics," he said. "If Carney and Smith can keep the pipelines open and investors calm, we all win." But separatist groups saw things differently. The Alberta Prosperity Project, which has been campaigning for a 2026 independence referendum, accused both leaders of selling out to global climate bureaucrats. Its petition drive collected nearly 120,000 signatures by late September, about a third of the total required to trigger a province-wide vote. Posters reading "Ottawa out" appeared on grain silos across central Alberta. A poll by Cardinal Research found that 28% of Albertans now say they would seriously consider voting to leave Canada if a referendum were held. That's up 8 points since last year. Still, not everyone buys the rhetoric. In Edmonton, restaurant owner Amira Hassan says the talk of separation scares away investors and tourists. "We're finally rebuilding after the pandemic," she said. "The last thing we need is another political circus." Many small business owners echo her concern. Rising interest rates and supply chain costs have already squeezed margins. A constitutional crisis could tip them over the edge. The Alberta Chamber of Commerce warned that uncertainty could cost the province up to 25,000 jobs if foreign firms delay investments. At the federal level, Carney walks a tightrope. He must acknowledge Western frustration without alienating voters in Ontario and Quebec, who worry about environmental backsliding. His tactic has been to emphasize partnership, not punishment. During a recent town hall meeting in Edmonton, he told the crowd, "We can disagree on policy, but not on belonging. Alberta's success is Canada's success." Historically, Alberta's premiers have gained popularity by fighting Ottawa. Peter Lougheed did it in the 1970s over resource control, Ralph Klein in the 1990s over transfer payments, and Jason Kenney in the 2020s with fiery anti-federal rhetoric. Smith followed the same script, but Carney changed the ending. Instead of another public feud, Canadians are watching a federal leader treat Western anger as an engineering problem, not an emotional one. That makes it harder for separatists to claim victimhood. Carney's approach also resonates internationally. While Smith threatens lawsuits and plebiscites, Carney is busy turning Alberta into a showcase of energy transition. By aligning carbon capture with export expansion, Canada can sell cleaner oil to Asia and Europe at a premium. Analysts at RBC Capital Markets predict Canadian crude exports could rise 7% in 2026 despite global decarbonization targets, largely because of new efficiency gains. For Alberta, that means revenue stability. For Ottawa, it means credibility at climate summits. Meanwhile, south of the border, Donald Trump has been stirring the pot. In a televised rally, he praised Alberta as America's natural ally and hinted that an independent Alberta could join a new North American energy bloc. His remarks drew cheers from his base but condemnation from Canadian officials. Former United States Ambassador Bruce Heyman called the comments reckless meddling. For Carney, it was proof that foreign actors see political opportunity in Canada's internal rifts. In July, investigative reporters revealed that several Trump-aligned donors had explored a $500 million investment fund to support Alberta's independence movement, allegedly under the guise of energy partnerships. The revelation sent shockwaves through Ottawa. Carney's response was subtle but firm. Without mentioning Trump by name, he told journalists that Canada's unity is not for sale. Behind closed doors, the Department of Finance issued new rules restricting foreign funding for provincial political advocacy. That single move blunted one of Trump's favorite pressure points. Alberta's independence campaign, once amplified by American talk show hosts, suddenly lost its international financing stream. Trump raged online, accusing Carney of killing free enterprise, but the damage was done. Canada had closed the back door. Carney's calm handling of Trump contrasts sharply with the former president's bombast. Whereas Trump thrives on chaos, Carney projects competence. His communication style, measured, deliberate, almost technocratic, has earned him approval ratings near 49% nationally, up 5 points since June. Among Albertans, his numbers remain low at 33%, but that's an improvement from last year's 24%. Political strategist Shachi Kurl notes that Carney doesn't need to win Alberta. He just needs to make staying in Canada look more profitable than leaving. That calculus is working. The provincial budget now shows a $2.1 billion surplus thanks to steady oil prices and new federal infrastructure grants. Carney's government has quietly increased equalization transfers by 4% while allowing Alberta more flexibility in spending them. The result is that municipalities facing infrastructure backlogs, from Lethbridge to Grand Prairie, are finally seeing projects resume. Ordinary citizens are noticing the difference. In Fort McMurray, pipeline worker Cody Lambert says he's still skeptical of Ottawa but appreciates the new job openings tied to carbon capture retrofits. They can call it whatever they want, he said, as long as it keeps us working. That sentiment, resentful yet pragmatic, is exactly what Carney hopes to harness. Still, challenges remain. The Alberta Teachers Federation's ongoing strike has drawn 51,000 educators out of classrooms, disrupting families and adding to the sense of provincial turmoil. Inflation in Calgary sits at 3.8%, above the national average, driven by housing costs and fuel. Rural communities complain that federal emissions caps hurt farm machinery prices. Carney's office insists solutions are coming, but patience is thin. The larger question is psychological. Can cooperation compete with outrage? Political scientists argue that anger mobilizes voters faster than reason. Smith's fiery speeches and Trump's provocations generate viral clips. Carney's measured explanations rarely do. Yet, over time, competence often outlasts chaos. Former Saskatchewan Premier Roy Romanow put it succinctly, "People can't live on rebellion. They have to live on results." International observers are watching closely. The Financial Times described Carney's handling of Alberta as a masterclass in federal diplomacy, noting that by neutralizing Western alienation, he simultaneously strengthens Canada's position in global energy markets. European leaders see Carney as a stabilizing counterpart to populist turmoil elsewhere. Within Canada, Even some conservative members of parliament quietly admit that the Prime Minister's tone has lowered the political temperature. But there are risks. If Carney's promised projects stall, or if oil prices crash, separatists will claim vindication. Smith's government has already passed legislation allowing citizen-initiated referenda with reduced signature thresholds, making it easier to reignite the issue. Should economic anxiety rise, calls for independence could resurface overnight. Carney's team knows this, which is why they are racing to deliver tangible wins before year-end. Expanded rail corridors, rural broadband, and new housing incentives aimed at young Albertans. Ultimately, the standoff between Smith and Carney is about more than policy. It's about identity. Smith bets that confrontation fuels pride. Carney bets that cooperation builds prosperity. One thrives on anger, the other on endurance. The outcome will shape not just Alberta's future, but the Federation's stability for decades. For now, Carney appears to be winning the long game. His patient strategy has cooled tempers, drawn investment, and isolated foreign agitators. Even some of Smith's allies admit privately that separation feels less urgent when the province is flush with cash and projects are moving again. In a recent interview, Carney summed up his philosophy. "We've been here before. Alberta has fought Ottawa before. But every time we found a way forward, this time will be no different. Whether that confidence proves justified will depend on results in the months ahead. A province that has felt ignored for generations is finally being courted with respect. A prime minister once dismissed as an outsider now walks a careful line between empathy and authority. And a movement once fueled by resentment is discovering that rebellion loses power when the other side simply refuses to fight back." As Canada heads toward winter, the story of Carney and Alberta has become more than a political drama. It's a test of whether quiet cooperation can still triumph in an age of noise. The stakes are enormous: national unity, economic stability, and the very idea that in Canada, arguments end not with division, but with dialogue. If Carney's gamble pays off, he will have rewritten the unwritten rule of Canadian politics, that the West must always rage to be heard. If it fails, the map of this country could look very different by 2026. One thing is certain: the battle for Alberta's heart has only just begun.
Another northern beer store is closing in November, this time in South River. This is the 7th northern beer store to be shuttered and will close November 16th. The beer stores on Notre Dame Avenue in Sudbury and on Valois Drive in Mattawa are also slated to close in November. Little Current and Noelville will shut down October 18th, and 2 other Sudbury locations were closed over the summer.
The collapse of Ontario's traditional beer system has turned into a national embarrassment. It started quietly,
it's about to get harder
with one
to
beer
crack
store
a
in
cold
South
one
River
in Ontario
announcing its
as
closure.
The beer store announces
Within months,
another round of store closures.
The story spread across the province like wildfire. By October 6, 2025, 7 more stores in northern Ontario had shut their doors, and the list keeps growing. What once looked like a normal retail adjustment now feels like a total breakdown. From Sudbury to Cornwall, from Brampton to Beaverton, the beer store is vanishing, taking with it nearly a century of routine, community, and stability. And at the center of the storm is Prime Minister Mark Carney, who promised competence but is now accused of presiding over chaos. In the last 12 months, more than a dozen beer stores have been permanently closed. South River, Alexandria, Beaverton, Cornwall, and the Brampton Main Street location all shuttered. Hundreds of unionized workers are now out of jobs, and the fallout is rippling across entire towns. When the beer store's vice president tried to calm the situation, calling it part of a marketplace expansion, most Ontarians heard something different. Expansion for whom? For the big grocery chains that now sell beer and wine, or for the communities left behind with no place to recycle their bottles and cans. It's not progress when the system that managed over 1.6 billion empties last year is dismantled without a replacement. For decades, Ontario's beer store wasn't just a place to buy beer. It was the backbone of the province's recycling network. Last year alone, consumers brought back over 1.6 billion empties for refunds. That meant millions of dollars in deposits returned to households and thousands of part-time incomes for people collecting bottles. Now that structure is disintegrating. With every closure, the province loses another drop-off point. Some communities have already lost every beer store within an hour's drive. A resident in Noelville said, "We're not getting more choice. We're getting more distance. Who's going to drive an hour to return a bag of cans? Ontario's beer store system was efficient and environmentally effective. It kept glass and aluminum out of landfills and gave consumers a direct financial reason to recycle. The system was praised globally as a model of corporate environmental cooperation, but that success story is being erased one closure at a time. Starting January 1st, 2026, every grocery and convenience store selling alcohol will be legally required to accept empties and pay refunds. On paper, it sounds reasonable, modern even. In practice, it's chaos. Most grocers have no space, no staff, and no infrastructure to manage bulk returns. Sticky bags of empties can't sit in small back rooms beside bread and produce. Grocery chains like Metro and Loblaws have already sounded alarms, saying they are not equipped to handle the volume. Their trade group, the Retail Council of Canada, called the plan a logistical nightmare. Some retailers are even considering dropping alcohol sales entirely rather than deal with the new recycling responsibility. The head of one mid-sized grocery chain told a local reporter that the government had given them an impossible task. We can sell beer, but now we're expected to run mini recycling depots too. This isn't sustainable. If that happens, consumers will have more stores that can sell beer but fewer willing to sell it, creating yet another layer of confusion. The transition has been disastrous for workers as well. The union representing beer store employees estimates that hundreds of stable unionized jobs will disappear by next spring. Many workers will receive small severance packages or be forced to relocate. For smaller towns, these were not just jobs, they were community anchors. In Little Current and South River, the beer store was one of the few consistent employers offering benefits and security. Those positions are now gone. As one worker put it, "We used to serve everyone in town. Now the shelves are empty, and so is my schedule." When Ontario Premier Doug Ford announced the early termination of the beer store's exclusive contract, his government paid a $225 million penalty to end it. The move was meant to bring consumer freedom and modernize the market. But instead of competition, what Ontarians got was confusion. The infrastructure that took nearly a century to build is now being torn down faster than it can be replaced. Environmental groups are warning that Ontario's deposit return rate could collapse, leading to more bottles and cans in ditches, rivers, and landfills. Environmental Defence Canada stated that without the beer store network, recycling rates could drop by 40% within 2 years. For many small businesses, the beer store closures have been another blow in an already fragile economy. Local pubs and convenience store owners now face new costs and responsibilities. They must manage beer returns or lose customers who used to rely on the beer store system. A small store owner in North Bay said, "We don't have room for sticky bottles. We're running on thin margins already." This just makes it worse. For small-town grocers, the government's policy feels like another example of how decisions made in Toronto ignore life in rural Ontario. At the political level, the situation is turning into a storm. Prime Minister Mark Carney has faced increasing backlash from opposition parties, local governments, and even former allies. He was elected on promises of stability and competence, but critics now accuse him of mismanaging the transition and failing to anticipate the consequences. Carney built his reputation as a calm technocrat, a man who handled global finance and international banking crises. But leading a country through retail and recycling collapse is proving to be a very different challenge. His opponents call it a meltdown, even describing his reaction to criticism as a tantrum fit. Carney's public image is taking a beating. During a press event last month, when asked about the beer store closures, he dismissed the issue as market evolution. His tone angered many Ontarians who see the closures not as evolution but extinction. In response, ND PMP Rachel Singh said, "This isn't evolution. This is erosion. Working people are losing jobs, seniors are losing access, and small businesses are losing patience. Even conservative voices who once supported deregulation now warn that the rapid collapse of beer store infrastructure could harm the province's environmental reputation and cost taxpayers far more than the $225 million already spent." The chaos also raises bigger questions about who controls essential systems. For decades, Ontario relied on a cooperative model between industry and government to manage recycling. The beer store collected containers, processed materials, and ensured deposits were refunded efficiently. With its decline, that system is splintering. Some experts argue this is part of a broader trend, public control giving way to corporate convenience. Economist Linda Park of the University of Toronto explained, "We're witnessing the privatization of responsibility. The government calls it modernization. But in practice, it shifts costs to consumers and small businesses. Meanwhile, on the ground, the consequences are piling up. Seniors who used to walk to their neighborhood beer store now face long drives. People who relied on bottle returns for extra cash are losing that side income. Refunds are being left unclaimed. In low-income neighborhoods, where every dollar counts, that loss is significant. Municipalities are reporting an increase in litter as people dump bottles rather than return them. Waste management costs are already rising. A study by the Ontario Waste and Recycling Council projected that if even 20% of beer containers go unreturned, municipalities could face an additional $15 million annually in cleanup costs. Environmental experts are urging the federal government to intervene. Canada's Recycling Association has warned that if the beer store system collapses entirely, it could take a decade to rebuild similar efficiency. Their statement reads, "What Ontario built over 100 years cannot be replicated overnight. Without central coordination, collection rates will decline, contamination will rise, and the environmental footprint will grow." This echoes the warnings from environmental defense groups who say Ontario could lose its position as Canada's leader in recycling efficiency. Local residents are voicing frustration and disbelief. In Sudbury, a 72-year-old resident said, "I walk to the beer store every week to drop off bottles. It kept my neighborhood clean, and it gave me some pocket change. Now it's gone, and the grocery store near me said they're not ready to take empties yet. What am I supposed to do?" Others say they've started giving up on returns altogether. Carney's government insists the transition will stabilize by 2026, but few believe that timeline. Union leaders predict more closures are coming next year. The United Food and Commercial Workers Union has already warned that beer store jobs will be cut again in 2026 once contractual obligations end. Environmental watchdogs warn that Ontario's deposit return program, officially guaranteed until 2031, may not survive to that date if participation keeps dropping. The system worked because it was simple. The beer store had clear rules, uniform deposits, and centralized collection. The irony is painful. The beer store system was one of Canada's quiet success stories. It provided jobs, reduced waste, and helped build a culture of responsible consumption. It wasn't flashy, but it worked. Now, that stability is being replaced by uncertainty. As one former employee put it, it wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Now, it's just gone. The emotional toll is real. In towns like Cornwall and Hearst, where beer stores were community fixtures, closures are being compared to losing a library or post office, an institution disappearing from the local map. Politically, the story is far from over. Critics are calling for an emergency review of the deposit return system and potential government intervention to preserve what remains. Some opposition members of Parliament argue that Ottawa should provide emergency funding to maintain the beer store infrastructure until a fully functional alternative exists. Business groups are demanding clarity on how recycling will operate once the grocers take over. For now, the only certainty is confusion. Mark Carney's promise of steady leadership is unraveling. The beer store debacle has become more than a provincial policy issue. It's a symbol of bureaucratic arrogance and poor planning. For ordinary Canadians, the frustration is clear. They're paying higher prices, losing jobs, and watching a system that worked perfectly well crumble before their eyes. What started as one store closing in South River has turned into a lesson in how modernization without management can destroy decades of progress. As more beer stores prepare to close their doors before year's end, Canadians are left asking the same question: what exactly is the government in control of anymore? The beer store collapse has shown that even the simplest systems can fall apart when leaders trade careful planning for political theater. For a prime minister who built his image on calm authority, Carney now faces a growing chorus calling his leadership erratic, impulsive, and unprepared. The only thing more unstable than Ontario's beer system right now, critics say, is the man in charge of it.